Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast in 10 minutes or less, or at least we try, definitely no more than 15 minutes. Today we're going to talk about a really important group of really well-connected people. Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy in 10 minutes, and I think you're going to enjoy this one. Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are one with me, to the churches of Galatia. Now this Paul, he really got around in the early part of the first century. News also traveled all over the Roman world to him, especially on what early churches were and weren't doing. Letters. Paul is a fixer. He was a fixer of sort of local early Christian churches, and so many needed so much fixing early on. But that's a different story. The Galatians and the issues inside of their church is the really interesting issue we're going to talk about today. But the history that got a group of Gauls who follow Jewish customs in central Turkey is a fascinating story too. The Galatians have a prominent place in the New Testament and early Christian history, and we're going to find out how this group got where they were from where they were. Before we get too far, though, what was this group of Gauls doing in central Anatolia during the first century CE? We know the Celts of modern-day Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and maybe even Brittany and France. We know them. These are referred to as the insular Celts. We also know the Celts in the form of Gauls of modern-day France who fought Julius Caesar amongst other Roman generals. To find out how the Celts of Galatia got to Anatolia, we need to go further back to the early Iron Age. The Iron Age cultures of Latin and Hallstatt in Central Europe are the main issue of the day, and that's where the Celts are this is their fountainhead. This is the homeland of the Celts. One was in kind of more or less modern-day Austria, one a little bit further into modern-day Switzerland. From Central Europe, Celts spread out into modern-day France, Germany, Spain, the Czech Republic, and northern Italy. In the 390s-ish BCE era, they attacked and sacked the city of Rome. And the Celts influenced many of aspects of what we would consider really classically Roman. They even invented, or at least popularized, the idea of wearing pants. So that's a major thing to definitely thank the Celts for. These Celts, though, they were constantly on the move. About 100 years later, after they had sacked Rome, a group of Celts went east. They attacked Greece and even sacked the Oracle of Delphi. They moved further east into Anatolia and sacked and pillaged along the way. Greece and different parts of Anatolia, sacking. Various kings in Anatolia used them as mercenaries, but these Celts always returned to pillaging from their mercenary activities. I'm going to avoid introducing a lot of names here. I'll be using enough geographical areas with constantly shifting borders to make things confusing enough as it is. So this is all in the context of the wars of the successors of Alexander the Great, all of these different kingdoms fighting each other. His generals were always fighting each other and needed great fighters as mercenaries like these Celts. Eventually, the Celtic tribes were given their own land to settle, and that's a great story too, and that directly connects us back to today. Two brothers were fighting over the kingdom of Bithynia, kind of to the northern part of that Asia Minor, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey area. One brother used the Celts to take out the other. Now, the new king had a problem. What do I do with these Celts? Well, he gave the Celts land to settle on the border of a neighboring area called Phrygia. Too bad there were Phrygians living there already, but that wasn't the king of Bithynia's problem. He didn't care. The Celts weren't his problem anymore either. These Anatolian Celts had their own homeland, or more like a base of operation for raiding. The Phrygians weren't a problem anymore either for the king of Bithynia, so it was really a win-win for him. Well, the years rolled on, more fighting, more raiding. The Celts won some, they lost some. If we look at this famous statue of the dying Gaul, you'll get an idea of that these Celts really retained a lot of their cultural traits. The dying Gaul statue represents a naked Gaulish soldier or warrior, and he features a lot of classical Gaulish elements. He had the spiky hair and a big drooping mustache. He also was seated with Celtic objects like a shield, a sword, and a neck torque. The Romans came and conquered this whole area, and by this time that the Romans came to town, the Celts had mixed a lot with the local populations. They adopted various parts of Greek, Roman, Luwian, and other local indigenous cultures, languages, and religion. They still kept many aspects of their original Celtic culture too, including certain Celtic religious practices and even governmental organizations. There's some evidence of human sacrifice as well. Human sacrifice was not very common amongst Greeks and other groups who were living in Asia Minor, but it was quite common amongst the Celts, and we have a lot of evidence of that. Speaking of evidence, we also have DNA evidence from skeletons found in Anatolia, which show Central European genes, not just traces, but large percentages. Now, to circle us back around to Christian history, the Romans reorganized the area that would be called Galatia and expanded its boundaries. It still had an area of ethnic Celts who genetically and culturally mixed with local populations. It also included a Galatia that had other groups, especially there was a population of this new Galatia that held a pretty significant Jewish population. Now, the Galatians became front and center for a conflict again during the mid-1st century CE between the early Christians and the early Jews over how to interact with non-Jews known as Gentiles. How to interact with Gentiles was a very important issue in both the early history of Christianity and of the Judaism of the time. Contrary to popular belief, Jews were not against people converting to Judaism, especially during the Second Temple period. Gentiles could become Jewish, but they also had to accept Judaism in its entirety, including circumcision and following all the laws of Moses. Commonly, you'll think of kosher rules, probably as the most well-known of them, but there's many, many others governing basically every aspect of a person's life. Jews really weren't allowed by the law, this Mosaic or halakhic law, to associate much with Gentiles, and they weren't even supposed to eat with Gentiles. And there was an interesting intermediate step for Gentiles who couldn't or wouldn't become fully Jewish. They were called God-fearers. They accepted the God of the Jews and lived by some of the Jewish principles, but they didn't fully become Jewish. Now, Galatia was a metropolitan polyglot place. There was a sizable Jewish and God-fearer population in and about Galatia. That is where Paul the Apostle enters the equation. Paul was actually from one province over, practically a local, not quite, but it was an angle he had to work as someone who was trying to bring in this new Christian faith. Possibly that, and it's quite possible that the Galatians were converted very early, sometime in the late 40s AD. And that's based on a possible dating of the letters of the Galatians in the New Testament written by Paul. As early as 48 and maybe a little bit later into the mid-50s, but either way, very early. Now here comes the conflict. The Galatians were Gentiles. Some blend, like we said, of the native populations, but definitely Gentiles. They were initially converted to Paul's form of Christianity, in which Gentiles didn't have to follow the Mosaic law or the halakha at all to convert. No circumcision, no anything of the sort. But almost as soon as Paul was out, moving on to the next place, Christians came in and started converting these newly converted Christians to the Jewish Christian brand of Christianity. In the Jewish Christian system, Gentiles had to become a full Jew before they could become a full Christian, so kind of a two-step process. Well, Paul just lost his mind when he heard this happened amongst the Galatians. He fired up this letter to the Galatians, which is one of his most strongly worded letters. He then went to Galatia and just chased around the province by the other Christians who were there and other people, and he was nearly stoned to death. Paul had a major conflict, what he termed the Judaizers, and these were the Jewish Christians. They were Jews who believed that Christ was somehow the Messiah, and they believed that they were the ones who believed that you really had to adopt the fullness of their brand of Judaism, because there was a lot of different brands of Judaism going on at the time. Peter, the apostle, kind of hung out with these Judaizers. And I should probably say that Judaizer became a pejorative term even at that time. But so the apostle Peter, he kind of started hanging out with the Jewish Christians and adopted some of their ways. And there's a famous incident that was described in the letter of Galatians that it didn't happen in Galatia, it happened in Antioch, where Peter was hanging out with Gentile Christians until some of these Jewish Christians said, no, you can't hang out and you can't eat with Gentiles. And Paul actually got into Peter's face and denounced him for caving into the Jewish Christians. And this was called the incident at Antioch. Jewish Christians thought people like Paul were just too lenient to the Gentiles and were throwing away the real Christian faith. The faith that they had always held had, as Jews, had become into its fullness with Jesus. And that Paul was just too lax and was watering down this Jewish Christian faith. And according to the Jewish Christians, they used his own words against him. In 1 Corinthians, Paul writes, I became all things to all men so that by all means I might save some. And could this really be applied to the Galatians? Hey, want to eat pork? Sure, that's fine. Don't want to get circumcised? Don't worry about it. No problem. As long as you follow my brand of Christianity, Paul's brand. In the end, Paul and the Jewish Christians were onto something. Paul was crafting a universal faith to present to Gentiles. The Jewish Christians were upholding what they saw as the critical function of their version of Second Temple Judaism. Most of these issues would be ironed out at the First Ecumenical Council of the Church, the Council of Jerusalem, or the Apostolic Council, documented in the Book of Acts. Basically, Paul would continue with his style, the Jewish Christians continued with their way, but that was a whole different story. And the Galatians hung on to some of their beliefs in this area of Galatia, hung on to certain Jewish practices long after the Council of Nicaea, and they really wouldn't fade out until afterwards. But, well, there we go with another bit of papal and church history in 10 minutes. Thank you to all our Patreons on patreon.com. Join us there to support the show and make sure to click like and subscribe and ring the bell to get more videos like this, and I'll see you next time.